Chapter 9 of The Blue Aunt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Elaine Conway. The Blue Aunt by Eliza Orne White. Chapter 9. The Little Gays. Jim and Evelyn had never had such a good time in all their lives as they had now. Just to be at the seashore was enough to make them very happy. But to have 4 children to play with greatly added to their pleasure. Patty and Ralph and Lily invented exciting new games, and little Rodman was a darling. Golden Rod, the children called him, because he was so sunny. He was always ready to be a horse, or a child, or an automobile, or a private soldier, or anything else the others did not want to be. There were so many things to do that the day was not half long enough. It began very early indeed for the little Gays, because Aunt Hilda, who always got breakfast, liked to have the work well out of the way before it was time to go in bathing. The little Gays all did some of the housework. Patty and Lily made the beds and helped with the dishes, and Ralph carried the water upstairs and did many other things. Jim and Evelyn were so interested that they asked if they could not make their beds. A high school girl whose name was Florence came every morning to help Mrs. Gay get dinner, while Aunt Hilda went in bathing with the children. This was the great treat of the day. Aunt Hilda was teaching the younger ones how to swim, with the help of Patty and Ralph, who were good swimmers for their age. After the bath the children played in the sand, while Mrs. West and Aunt Hilda sat and watched them or played with them. They were allowed to go barefoot, so it did not matter if they let the little waves come up over their feet. The 2 families separated for dinner and came together again for a wonderful afternoon. If the tide were low sometimes, Aunt Hilda would take the children and Hector for a walk along the sunny yellow sands, far, far out to where they joined the blue sea, where the children waded into all the little pools along the way. And there were 2 great occasions when they went clam digging. Always, before the 2 families separated for supper, Aunt Hilda had what she called the children's half-hour, when they gathered about her the Gays' broad piazza, if it were pleasant, or in the big living room, if it was stormy, while she told them stories. One day Mrs. West had a bright idea. "Why shouldn't we all dine together?" she said. "It seems such a pity to separate. It would not be much more trouble for Catherine to cook for us all, and Florence could help her prepare the vegetables and wash the dishes." Catherine and Florence thought this an excellent plan, and so did Mrs. Gay, because she would not have to get dinner any more, and Aunt Hilda was pleased because Mrs. Gay could now come down on the beach with them, and every single child cried, "Goody, goody, goody! What fun!" or something that meant the same thing. So there were no 2 happier families in all the state than the Gays and Wests, on the day when they decided to have their dinners together. But alas, something unforeseen happened. It proved that to bring the little Gays and the little Wests together at dinner was like scratching matches on a match-scratcher. The matches are as quiet as mice so long as you leave them in a dish, but once you scratch them on the match-scratcher, things become very lively indeed. And when the little Gays dined with the little Wests, things were very, very lively. It was like a conflagration, and no one seemed able to put out the fire. The older people could not hear themselves talk, for all 6 children seemed to think of so many things to say. Their voices grew louder and louder, and neither Mrs. Gay nor Mrs. West could make any impression on them. Mrs. Gay would say, "Children, don't all talk at once." And Mrs. West would say, "Children, I am almost crazy with the noise." And Aunt Hilda, who was the only one who could have made Their mind did not feel it was her place to say anything when two mothers were present. After this had been going on for a few days, Mrs. Gay said to her, "Hilda, I think your niece and nephew are dear children, and they are very spirited and interesting, but I should not have supposed that two extra children could make more noise than all of my four put together. What shall we do about it?" And Mrs. West took Hilda aside and said, "Evelyn and Jim had such good table manners and were so quiet at meals. I don't know what their father will say when he comes down again. The Gays are delightful children, but they have a most demoralizing effect on my two, and yet I can't draw back when I've asked them to have dinner at my house. Can you make any suggestion?" "If you will give me authority to make them mind, and tell the children this," said Aunt Hilda, "I am pretty sure I can have quiet dinners." Mrs. West's brown eyes grew larger and larger, and she said, "What are you going to do?" Aunt Hilda smiled and said, "That is my secret." When Mrs. Gay heard that Hilda had some plan, she was so curious she could hardly wait for the next day's dinner time to come. The next morning it rained, and this made it hard for the children. But it was no ordinary rain. It poured, and the wind blew a gale and drove the rain all across the piazza where they had been having their dinners. And there were two bad leaks in the roof, so that Evelyn and her mother had to put a wash bowl in the middle of their bed to catch the water, and Catherine had to put another bowl on the top of her trunk. "Anyway, we can go in bathing," said Evelyn hopefully. "Not today, dear," said Aunt Hilda. "But we can't get any wetter than the water gets us," said Evelyn. But Aunt Hilda, who always went with them, said even she drew the line at going in bathing in such a fierce northeast storm with a flock of lively children. "Do you know," she said, as she sat down in the Wests' living room with a box full of coloured advertisements and bits of bright coloured paper, "your mothers have given me authority to make you mind, and I am going to make my badge this morning, and you can all help me." Evelyn and Lily brought up a little seat with arms, which they were fond of sitting in. There was just room for the two of them to squeeze in, and Ralph, who sat behind them, began to braid their hair together, so that they could not be separated. He took the hair on the left-hand side of Lily's head and braided it into the hair on the right-hand side of Evelyn's head, and Lily called out, "Stop, Ralph!" But he went on. "You kids seem to want to be together all the time, and I'll fix it so you are like one person, just like the Siamese twins. Your hair is so much the same color, you look as if you belonged together." "I don't like to be called a kid. I'm a child," said Lily, and Evelyn asked who the Siamese twins were, but before any one could answer her she said, "What are you making, Aunt Hilda? Why are you cutting out those letters?" "They are for my badge." She had a white linen belt in her hand, and she began to paste on it some letters that she cut out of blue paper. The first letter she pasted on was a P. "What does that stand for?" she asked. "I don't know what letter it is," said Evelyn. Lily looked at her with amazement, because she had known how to read for more than a year, and even like Rodman, who was not quite 4, said, "I know, it is a P." Evelyn looked at it very hard, so she should never forget it, and Lily said, "It stands for Papa." "And for peaches and pineapples," said Ralph. "And peonies and poppies," said Patty. "And it stands for Patty," said Jim. "Are you going to put all our initials on in a row?" "You shall see," said the Blue Aunt, and she pasted a blue O next to the P. Even Evelyn knew that it was an O. "P.O." "That's the beginning of postman," said Ralph, and presently Aunt Hilda put an L next to it. "That stands for Lily," the little girl cried, and she was so pleased she got up and began to dance about the room, but Evelyn cried "Ouch!" and Lily had to stop. She had quite forgotten that she and Evelyn were fastened together, and they hastily unbraided their hair. Evelyn said, "Isn't there going to be an E for Evelyn?" for she knew a good many of her letters. "Wait and see," said Aunt Hilda, and she cut out and pasted on an I. "That stands for all of you," she said. "It is I, for I myself." Evelyn was so pleased at this that she said over and over, "It is an I, and it stands for I, myself. I shall never forget it. It is tall and slim like a person, and it stands for I, myself." "I know what it's going to be," said Ralph. "It is going to be political boss. Aunt Hilda is going to be the boss and make us all mind." Just by way of saying something, Jim remarked, "She isn't your Aunt Hilda at all." Ralph started to have a mock fight with him. Jim had often said this before, and with the same result. "It isn't going to be political boss, after all," said Ralph, for Aunt Hilda was pasting on a C. "That stands for Catherine," said Jim. "No, it doesn't," said Ralph. "Catherine begins with a K." "It does not," said Jim. "It begins with a C-A-T, just like cat." "It begins with a K-A-T," Ralph insisted. "I guess I know how Catherine is spelled, because it is my mother's name." "I can't help it," said Jim. "I guess I know how Catherine is spelled because I've seen it on the outside of lots of letters for Catherine. Doesn't Catherine begin with a C-A-T, Aunt Hilda?" "It can begin either with a C-A-T or a K-A-T. You are both right," she said. "You can remember, Evelyn, that C stands for crescent, because it looks so much like the new moon reversed." When Evelyn had not wanted to take the trouble to learn to read, her father took her part and said, "I ruined my eyes by reading when I was 4 years old. I don't care if Evelyn does not learn until she is 8." And then, a year later, he had been surprised that she did not know all of her letters, for he was a busy man with important law cases on his mind, so he did not remember all the small family affairs. Now Evelyn longed to read, but she had never longed for anything except a pussy cat. "Oh, it is police! It is police!" Jim cried in delight, as his Aunt Hilda pasted on an E for Evelyn. "There is more to it than that," she said, as she left a space and began another word with a W. "It is going to be policewoman. I know it is," cried Patty, and policewoman was just what it was. Aunt Hilda pinned the white belt with the blue letters on it around her waist and said, "Whenever I wear this belt and tell you to do something, you must do it at once." That day at dinner, which had to be in the living room on account of the storm, the children were so quiet at first that neither Mrs. Gay nor Mrs. West could imagine what had happened. But as the meal went on, the children forgot about the policewoman, and Jim and Ralph started a lively discussion as to the way to sail a boat. Ralph said Jim was entirely wrong. He guessed he knew about boats because he had watched his father sail one all last summer. And Jim said, "I know I'm right." "You are quite wrong," said Ralph. "You always think you know a lot more than you do, and for a boy of your age, I guess if I were your age, I'd know more about boats than you do," said Jim. Lily insisted that Ralph was right, and Evelyn backed up Jim, although neither of the little girls knew one thing about it. And while all four were talking at once, Rodman said, "B stands for boat." B stands for boat, over and over again. Aunt Hilda, I'm right, ain't I? Said Ralph. You mustn't say ain't, said Patty. I can't say aren't I? You can say am I not? All right, I am right, am I not, Aunt Hilda? She isn't your Aunt Hilda, began Jim. I don't care if she isn't. She has known me a lot longer than she has known you, and she loves me a lot better. She doesn't. She does. Then all the children joined in, and the older people were almost crazy with the noise. When the uproar was the loudest, the Blue Aunt rose. She was tall, but now she looked much taller than usual, for she was standing on the tips of her toes, and she said, According to the authority conveyed to me by this badge, I command that there shall be instant silence. Not one child is to say anything for 10 minutes. And she took out her watch. The effect was like magic. All the children stopped talking, and if it had not been for the beating of the rain and the swish of the wind, one could have heard a pin drop. The two mothers were so surprised they could think of nothing to say, and Aunt Hilda told them how the widow Grey thought she would spare 3 eggs for them today, and if the rain held up, Ralph and Jim could go for them that afternoon. When the children's half hour came, they all gathered around Aunt Hilda in the Wests' pleasant living room. She sat on the broad window seat, and Tim immediately jumped up into her lap, while Hector lay down at her feet. Lily and Evelyn climbed up on the window seat, one on each other of her, and snuggled up against her, while Patty sat in a low seat close by, and the boys flung themselves down at her feet. I am going to read you some verses I wrote this afternoon, said the Blue Aunt. They are a kind of parable, and they are called The Sun. The little Wests and little Gays were closest friends, and yet they argued at their games and plays on stormy noons and sunny days, whene'er these children met. And when the sun sank in the west, ha! said the West's young son, you see he likes us much the best. He is always setting in the west when the long day is done. Indeed you're wrong, cried a young Gay. Ho! when the day is done, the sunset clouds are bright and gay. They're ours, not yours, I'm bound to say. Clouds glorify the sun. And so they argued all the night, and never stopped to think. They had a long continued fight, and talked from eve till light, and did not sleep a wink. And when the sun rose in the east, the Gay son Ralph said, Ho! He does not like you in the least, he loves the gay and cheerful east, he is your bitter foe. And then young West in accents loud said, Ha! He is not gay, he's rising in a murky cloud, I hear a peal of thunder loud, it is a dismal day. Then spoke the sun at dawn of day, though 'neath an angry cloud, I'm always bright and warm and gay, he's right this talkative young Gay, pray don't dispute so loud. And when at night I go to bed, tea's always in the west, exactly as young Jim has said. You both are right, the good sun said, I love you both the best. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Blue Aunt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elaine Conway. The Blue Aunt by Eliza Orne White. Chapter 10. The Birthday Dinner. Whenever any member of the West family was so fortunate as to have a birthday, he or she always had the privilege of choosing the dinner. But as Mr. West's birthday was in early August, and he is not coming down until the night before, the family had to choose it for him, for there was no butcher in Sandhurst, nor even a grocer, and so meals had to be planned some time ahead. Mrs. West said she would choose the soup, Jim might choose the second course, and Evelyn the dessert. "I wish we had a family of 10 or 12 children, and that every one had a birthday in a different month," said Evelyn. "Birthday dinners are so much nicer than our dinners." Jim said he would choose roast chicken for his course, with potatoes and summer squash and preserved plums. He was wise enough to ask for the things that he knew could be got. Evelyn chose strawberry ice cream and a birthday cake with frosting. "My darling child," said Mrs. West, "it is perfectly impossible to make strawberry ice cream. I don't believe we can get the extra milk and cream, and we would have to have a different flavor. And as for eggs for the cake, well, we'll see what we can do. We can have lemon water ice and crackers, if worst comes to worst." Aunt Hilda and the children set out on one of the scrambling walks that she loved as much as they did, across the moors and under the barbed wire fences, in search of provisions. All the children went except little Rodman. It was too far for him. Both households had a great supply of canned food sent down to them, as well as the usual groceries. But the things one wants fresh, like yeast cakes and fruit, could be had only once a week, when the grocer from the next large town sent his cart over. The butcher came only once a week, but fish could always be obtained from the local fishermen, if one were lucky enough to get down to the beach before they had to put their catch in the cold storage warehouse. And by engaging them ahead one could get delicious chickens. It was such a cloudless afternoon, and the sea and sky were both so blue that there was only a misty horizon line where one melted into the other. Evelyn and Lily danced and skipped with joy as they started on their walk over the moors, where the paths were like winding yellow ribbons as they went through the coarse silvery green grass. Evelyn and Lily each seized one of Aunt Hilda's hands, while Patty walked as near her as she could get, and Hector frisked on ahead with the boys. It was such a joyous afternoon that no one could help being happy. First they went to the Widow Gray's for eggs. She stood in the doorway of her house and talked, as if she were a machine wound up for the purpose. Only a machine runs down after a time, and it did not seem as if she ever would. She gave them all the news of the town before she got around to the subject of eggs, and then she told them that her eggs had all been engaged ahead. As she could only count on 6 a day now, well, seeing as it was a birthday, she would save 3 for them and let the Westons go without for once. "I don't want you to do that," said Hilda. "It won't hurt 'em a mite to go without for once. Every one's conserving food just now. There ain't no children in that family, only grown folks. You leave it to me. I'll manage. You don't need to have it on your conscience, miss. Just you send for the eggs to-morrow." "She said 'ain't,'" Ralph observed to Patty as they walked on. "She's a grown-up person, and she says 'ain't.'" Then they went to another house to see if they could get any squashes, and an old man who was bent over with rheumatism came hobbling out on his stick, and said he guessed he had "a plenty," but they'd have to go next door to Mrs. Caldwell's, as he and she were running the garden on shares. He gave the land, she did most of the work. Evelyn got so much interested in him and felt so sorry for his lameness that she did not go on with the others to Mrs. Caldwell's. She stayed with him and advised him to put on sweet oil and ammonia, which Aunt Charlotte used. "Bless my soul!" said the old man. "What a wise little head it is! How much sweet oil and how much ammonia? The proportion would make some difference." "I don't know how much, only it smells horrid and makes your eyes smart if you get near the ammonia bottle when she's putting it in. Does it hurt so you can't stand up straight? Could you walk without a stick if you had to?" "I might get a fall." "I'm so sorry," said Evelyn. "They are coming back with the squashes now. I guess I'll have to go, but I'll come again some day and bring my Virginia with me. She's my newest doll, and she has brown hair and brown eyes, and she opens and shuts them like a person. She's very beautiful, and I know you'd like to see her." "Come along, Evie, come along," said Jim. "We're going to the chicken farm now." They took a short cut and crawled under 3 barbed wire fences that had been put up on account of the cattle. They found the chicken man was expecting to kill off all his chickens on account of the high cost of grain. Evelyn thought this a poor plan, and as usual she did not hesitate to say so. "Couldn't all the chickens eat less, like people?" she asked. "Then the grain wouldn't cost so much, and there'd be enough for all." "Oh, Evie," said Jim, "if you don't beat the Dutch." They engaged a pair of chickens and stopped on the way back to get the candles for the cake. This meant a walk through the village with its quaint houses. They went to an old warehouse that was full of delightful jars of pickles and preserves that had been made on the Cape. They got some of the preserved beach plums and a jar of pickles, and then they went to the far side of the building where the bayberry candles were made. There were all sorts of them, ready to be packed in boxes. Some were huge and meant for a church. These were very smooth, and some were rough and the right size for a candlestick, while others were very small. All, big and little, smooth or rough, were of the same shade of silvery green, like the bayberry leaves and the sedge grass, and Evelyn thought she had never seen anything so beautiful in her life as these candles. "I would like to get one of those little ones to take home to Nancy," she said to Aunt Hilda. "Yes, that's her colour," said her aunt. "Gentle, faithful little Nancy is as restful and satisfactory as these silvery green candles." It was impossible to put 42 of these candles on any cake, so Aunt Hilda suggested that they should get 7 and put 4 in one group and 2 in another, and 1 in the centre to grow on. She said she was going to get one of the large church candles to save, to put in the window and burn at Christmas time. The candle place, as the children called it, was so delightful they could not bear to leave it, but finally Aunt Hilda said it was time to go home. She said she would take a short cut along the railroad track, as there would be no train for some hours. They were never allowed on the railroad track unless an older person was with them. Jim and Ralph skipped along over the ties, and Hector followed them, while Aunt Hilda and the 3 little girls came more slowly. Suddenly, as they were walking along in a leisurely way, they heard a whistle, and presently, above the sound of the wind, was the rush of a train coming rapidly towards them. Aunt Hilda's heart stood still. It was a freight train she did not know about. There were extra freight trains now, because they were moving so many supplies for the soldiers. "Ralph! Jim!" she called out. Ralph had already scrambled down the bank and was safe, But Jim, with Hector at his heels, was running toward them along the track. "Climb down the bank and take Lily," Aunt Hilda said to Patty, and she was just about to swing Hilda down when Jim took his little sister roughly in his arms and half carried her down the embankment. Hilda made a frantic grab at Hector, and soon all the party were clinging to the steeply sloping bank, while the freight train thundered by with its long line of cars. "You were a brave boy to come back for Evelyn," said Aunt Hilda. "I didn't know as you would manage so many," said Jem. "We'll never walk on the railroad track again," said Aunt Hilda. "No more short cuts for us." Getting ready for dinner was almost more fun than eating it, but that was very good fun, too, and it was such a joy to have their father come down. They were all so grateful to have frosted cake that they found no fault with lemon water ice. Then, to celebrate the day, Mr. West was able to get a strange looking carryall and a brown horse and take the party for a drive across the Cape to the open sea, its great waves, and the lighthouse, which the children had always longed to explore. Aunt Hilda and Mrs. Gay walked all the way to the other side, and Mrs. West could not walk so far, so she rode, and little Rodman rode all the way, but the other children took turns in walking and riding. They had a wonderful time watching the waves come in, and then they started to go to the lighthouse, but there was a soldier in khaki on guard, and he told them no one was allowed to go into the lighthouse any more. Mr. West was quite tried when he heard this. "Do we look like alien enemies?" he said. "Do you think it would do any harm to let us in?" "James," said Mrs. West, "the young man is only doing his duty. You are not so well known here as you are at home. We'll go into that little shop and buy some postal cards." It was rather a come down when they had expected to see the lighthouse, but the children were so thrilled by the sight they saw that they soon forgot their disappointment. Close by the door of the shop was a real khaki tent, the first Jim had ever seen, and just outside it was another soldier in khaki, and a girl in a pink dress was bringing him a saucer of pink ice cream. So there must be pink ice cream inside. They went in and sat down at two little tables, and they all had strawberry ice cream. As they ate it they watched a group of busy women who were knitting khaki-colored or gray sweaters. One younger woman was winding a ball of gray yarn, while a bronzed young sailor boy was holding the skein for her. Everybody agreed that afternoon when they got home that the birthday had been a grand success. But there was more to come, for soon after sunset there was the most frightful thunderstorm that the younger children had ever known. They all had supper together at the Wests' house on account of the birthday, and it was impossible for any one to go home, for the rain was pelting down in torrents, and the thunder was coming so close to the lightning that it seemed every minute as if the house would be struck. Then the rain changed to hail, which clattered against the windows. When the storm first broke, Aunt Hilda and Mr. West ran upstairs to shut the windows. There was a pool of water on Mrs. West's bed, and another on Catherine's trunk. It was very exciting. And all the time it was raining and hailing, the moon was shining, red and angry, through the storm. "I would not believe it if I had not seen it," said Mr. West. The storm ceased almost as suddenly as it came, and Aunt Hilda said, "See how peaceful and serene the moon looks now. It is a good omen for your new year, James. It means whatever storms you are to have, Everything will come out right for you in the end. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of The Blue Aunt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Elaine Conway. The Blue Aunt by Eliza Orne White. Chapter 11. The Story. The children were very sorry to have their 2 months at the seashore come to an end, for they were so fond of the little Gays, but early in September they had to go home on account of Jim's school. And as soon as they were back again, there was so much to do that they were usually as happy as the day was long. Nancy was going to school for the first time. Her mother had always been afraid to send her, for fear she would catch the contagious diseases from the other children, but a small private school was being started, and she thought the companionship with other children might be good for her. Evelyn begged very hard to be allowed to go, but no child was taken until she knew how to read. Evelyn had learned all her letters this summer, both the big ones and the little ones, and a few simple words, for she had begged Lily to teach them to her, and she now teased Nancy to teach her to read. Everyone in town, both older people and children, had become greatly interested in the fatherless children of France, and Jim and Evelyn and Nancy were eager to earn money to give them. One afternoon the little teacher had a picture book open in the Merrifields' nursery, where she was teaching Evelyn her lesson, when Mr. Merrifield came in. "Father, Evelyn wants to spell cat. K-A-T. You can't, can you?" "It sounds that way to me," said Evelyn with decision. "I said I was going to spell my cat that way. I have a pussy cat, and he sometimes catches a 'normous rat," she went on. "He doesn't," said conscientious Nancy. "He can't. He's so small." "He will when he gets big," said Evelyn confidently. "Mr. Merrifield, can't I spell cat with a K? Ralph Gay said his mother spelled her name with a K, and if Catherine can be, I should think a cat could." "It can't," said Mr. Merrifield decidedly. "It is odd, but it can't be. Spelling is one of the things that is good discipline for little girls who like their own way. You see, it is like this, Evelyn. There have to be rules about everything, so people can do good work. But you can spell your kitten with a K." "I'm glad of that," said Evelyn. "Oh, Mr. Merrifield, how can Nancy and I earn some money for the fatherless children of France?" Her brown eyes looked so wistful and appealing that Mr. Merrifield felt he must find some way at once. "How much do you want to earn?" he asked. "Oh, a lot of money. Aunt Hilda and mother are trying to get all the littlest children to give 25 cents, and children our size to give 50 cents, and the bigger sized ones like Jim 75 cents, and still older ones $1. "I'll tell you what I'll do," said Mr. Merrifield. "I'll pay Nancy 50 cents when she has taught you to read small sentences. It is unusual to pay a scholar for learning, but I'll give you a prize of 50 cents when you have learned to read these little sentences." Evelyn was so pleased at this that she got up and hugged Mr. Merrifield, which Nancy would never have thought of doing. "I'll never spell cat with a K as long as I live," she told him. "Even when Tim, my darling kitten, gets to be a cat. I thought I could spell my own cat the way I liked, but I see I can't." "No," said Mr. Merrifield. "It would be a bad example to other people. If the minister's little girl let you spell cat with a K, soon every child in the parish would be spelling it that way, and that would make a great scandal." "I hadn't thought of that," said Evelyn. It was really surprising how fast Evelyn learned to read, and she learned to print at the same time, for she was eager to make all the words she knew, and she drew little pictures to explain them. They were very strange little pictures, but you usually knew what she meant. One day she said to Nancy, "I'd like to write a story about Tim. I mean the kitten, not the chawman. Would you write it for me if I tell you what to say?" "Yes!" cried Nancy joyously. "You can dictate to me, the way father does to mother when his eyes are tired." "All right," said Evelyn. "It is to be for a birthday present for Jim, and I'll make the pictures." "I thought his birthday came in January," said Nancy. "It does, but Jim and I have agreed to have monthly birthdays. So the 13th of every month I am to have one, and he is to give me a present, and the 29th of every month he is to have one, and I am to give him a present. He didn't have anything ready for the 13th of September, for he forgot all about it, and spent all his money. So he just gave me a kiss, but that was very nice, because he does not kiss people generally. So he said to make it even, I must not spend any money on his September birthday, and anyway, we are both saving up for the fatherless children. So I thought I'd write a little story about Tim." "A true story?" said Evelyn firmly. "It is true, because he told it to me the other night when he was curled up in my lap." "It can't be true," said Nancy severely, "for cats can't talk." "He's a special kind of cat," said Evelyn. "Aunt Hilda says he's human, and when he sits in my lap his thoughts just skip out of his head and into mine." "They can't," said Nancy. "It isn't possible." "You don't know anything about it. He isn't your kitten." "I know what can be and what can't be," said Nancy. "Well, anyway, I can pretend anything I like, for it is a story." "That is just what I said. It is a story, not a true story. Tell me what to say." "It is called The Kitten's Dinner," said Evelyn. It took Nancy some time to write it down, and Evelyn decorated the sheet with a big round circle made with a yellow pencil, a smaller round circle above it, and 2 dots for eyes, 2 black marks standing up straight for ears, and a black mark for a tail. "It might be a rabbit," said Nancy doubtfully. "It is a kitten," said Evelyn. "It wouldn't be called The Kitten's Dinner if it was a rabbit." "He might dine on the rabbit." "Not my kitten," said Evelyn. "He's very 'ticular. Please don't talk so much." "That's what father says when mother makes suggestions. I'll keep quiet," said Nancy. "Once there was a little kitten, and his name was Tim, and every night he got into the lap of his little mistress, and her name was Evelyn, and he told her all the thoughts he thinked." "Don't talk so fast," said Nancy. "I don't know how to spell mistress." Just then Aunt Hilda came in. She had been helping Mrs. Merrifield with some war relief work, and she said it was time for Evelyn to go home. When she heard about the story she said Evelyn could dictate the rest of it to her, and she would write some rhymes to go at the end of it, and Evelyn could make as many pictures as she liked with her box of coloured crayons. This is the way the story read when it was finished. "Once there was a little kitten, and his name was Tim, and every night he got into the lap of his little mistress, and her name was Evelyn, and he told her all the thoughts he thinked. And they were funny thoughts, for he was a very little kitten, and he thinked a great deal about food. and he thinked of all the things he liked to eat, because he was small and knew no better, and they were fish and lamb and a few mice, but mostly fish. And he loved fish, he told me, just the way I loved oranges and grapes and bananas. And when I asked him which he liked best, the seashore or here, he said the seashore, because he most always had fish every day. And he tried eating other things, like Aunt Hilda's khaki yarn and strings, and they did not agree with him, and he said, "Give me fish every day, and I'll never eat khaki yarn any more." And Mr. West, that was Evelyn's father, said the fish bill would be just 'normous if we did, for his appetite was bigger than he was. I guess that's all the story I'll write this time, for I'm tired. When the pictures were added of a lamb and a mouse and several fishes, it was a very grand story, indeed, and Aunt Hilda wrote her rhymes on a separate sheet. A Kitten's View of Food Control. The food controller of our state ordered 2 meatless days. I'm sure the food controller's great, his name I'll loudly praise. 2 days of fish instead of 1, oh, why not make it 7? 7 days of fish would be such fun, 'twould be a kitten's heaven. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Blue Aunt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Elaine Conway. The Blue Aunt by Eliza Orne White. Chapter 12. Jim and the Orphans. Jim admired his father more than any other man in the whole world, and he was never so happy as when they went for a walk on Sunday afternoon, especially when they took what Jim called a real man's walk, which was too long for his mother and Evelyn. Sometimes Aunt Hilda went with them, but much as he liked her, he preferred having his father all to himself. He wanted to grow up just like his father, and he imitated many of his ways. He wished he had a pair of those big round spectacles his father wore, with the dark rims to them, but he had once tried them on, and they made everything look so small that he found they would be of no use to him. It was because of his devotion to his father that Jim was so stirred up over the fatherless children of France. "I'd like to go and kill all the people who killed the orphans' fathers," he said one day to his Aunt Hilda. "If you did there would be another set of fatherless children," she said. "It is one of the sad facts of war that such things have to be. And the worst of it is," he went on gloomily, "that even if the war lasts 6 years, I shan't be nearly of fighting age then, and I'm so afraid this will be the last war, and I'll never get a chance to fight." "We are fighting to make it the last war, dear. We want all the nations of the world to be like one big family, with the stronger ones looking out for the little ones, just as you took care of Evelyn that day on the railroad track. I'm so glad you want to help me with my orphans." "Can you speak French as well as you speak English?" he asked. "Not quite as well, but you see I lived in France till I was 7, and my father was half French, so I love France as I love no other country except America." Jim was eager to earn money for the cause, but his father was too busy with food control meetings and the Liberty Loan, in addition to his large law practice, to have time to make any suggestions, and his Aunt Hilda went off for a week's visit just at this time. Then one day a bright idea came to him. He thought of it one Friday in the middle of school, and he could hardly wait for his lessons to be over. As they were walking home together, he confided the plan to his friend, Charlie Norcross. "I'm going to pick some of our fruit and sell it for the benefit of the French orphans." "Gee, that's great," said Charlie. Charlie lived in the third story of an apartment house, so the idea appealed to him strongly. "I'm sure Mother'd like to buy some of your grapes and peaches," he said. "She's just crazy about making jellies and preserves, and the fruit costs so much at the stores." "But I'll have to charge a big price if it is for the orphans," Jim said, in his father's best manner. "That's all right. Mother said she supposed she'd have to give something to the orphans, and in this way she'd have the fruit too." Jim's father and mother went off Friday afternoon, to be gone until Monday morning. It was the anniversary of their wedding day, and they always celebrated it by doing something together without the children, and as their Aunt Hilda was still away, there was no one to ask about the fruit. "I won't mention it to Anne and Catherine," said Jim. "We'll just steal into the garden when they are not looking, just as if we were bad boys, and we'll get all we want before they see us. I'm sure Father and Mother won't mind. They are so crazy over the orphans." Charlie was not at all sure of this, but the prospect of feasting on the delicious peaches and grapes was too much for him, and so early Saturday morning he appeared with a fruit basket ready for the occasion. The boys stole down into the garden with Hector following at their heels. They had one narrow escape, for the ashman looked at them suspiciously when they were picking the peaches, but Jim called out cheerily, "It's just me, Jim West. Won't you have a peach?" So the ashman supposed it was all right. "Please don't tell Anne and Catherine what we are doing," said Jim. "We are going to sell the fruit for the benefit of the fatherless children of France. Mother and Father are keen about them, but Anne and Catherine might not understand." "Mummy's the word," said the ashman, and Jim felt he could be depended on. It was a beautiful basket of fruit, with grapes and peaches arranged by Charlie, who had a good deal of taste. "They are just samples," said Charlie. "People can order more." "I don't think we've made the grape jelly yet," said Jim doubtfully. Mrs. Norcross was in the kitchen when the boys arrived. She did all her own work except the washing and ironing, and she cooked delicious things. There was a smell of something frying which appealed to Jim. "Here's a doughnut for each of you," said Mrs. Norcross, as she took two from a pile that had just come hot off the stove. "Gee, I'm glad I came here," said Jim, as he took a large bite out of the doughnut. Mrs. Norcross had on a long blue and white checked apron with sleeves that covered her up, and her pretty hair was almost as golden as Evelyn's. Jim had never seen a prettier grown person. It did seem a shame to make her pay for the fruit, when she had been so kind about the doughnuts, and Mrs. Norcross was one of the friends to whom his mother sometimes sent fruit as a present. "I've brought you round a little of our fruit," he said. "We thought maybe you'd like some." Mrs. Norcross did not know that the older people were away, so she supposed Mrs. West had sent the basket of fruit. "Thank your mother very much. How daintily she always arranges things," said Mrs. Norcross, as she handed Jim another doughnut. "We are taking orders, Mother, for the benefit of the French orphans," said Charlie. "Do you care to order any grapes for jelly?" "Yes, I should be very glad of a peck, if you can spare as many." Jim's face fell, for he loved grape jelly. He had not intended to sell all the grapes. "I'll give you a little something to start with," said Mrs. Norcross, as she handed $half to Jim and another to Charlie. Then she went into the next room and brought out a little notebook and a pencil. At the top of the first page she wrote, "For the benefit of the French orphans," and also Jim's name and Charlie's. Under each of their names she wrote her own and the amount she had given. Madeleine B. Norcross, 50 cents. "If you write anything down you won't get mixed up about money. You can keep the pencil," she said. "What a clever idea of your father's to let you earn money in this way." Jim was about to say about the great idea was his own, but Charlie made signs to him. "Mother's awful particular," he said, as they went down the steps of the apartment house. "Maybe she'd think there was something wrong if she knew it was your plan." He was very anxious to secure the grapes before any investigation was made. The boys stopped at a grocer's to find out what the market price of grapes was, and Charlie borrowed a peck measure, for one of grocer's children was in the same class with Jim and himself at the public school. Mrs. Norcross paid them the market price for the grapes and a few cents over, and said she would make the jelly that very afternoon, for she had the good luck to have plenty of sugar, and people said sugar was going to be scarce. Jim was very much disappointed about the grapes, for they had had to take all there were to fill the order, except 2 bunches which they ate themselves, and he was not at all sure how the family would feel when they saw the bare vines. There were not enough peaches to sell in any quantity, and the apples were not ripe yet, so after dinner Jim and Charlie arranged a basket of peaches, and Charlie printed a sign on the piece of cardboard: "Peaches for sale for the benefit of the French orphans, 5 to 10 cents a peach. A good cause. Be generous." He was not sure about the spelling, but he thought it wiser not to ask either Ann or Catherine. "I think if we go where nobody knows us it will be more fun," he said, and they went down a side street. Ann and Catherine thought Jim was at Charlie's house, and Mrs. Norcross was quite at ease about Charlie, so no one was worried. The side street was very pleasant, for it overlooked a small park, and there were many women and children sunning themselves on the benches in the park. Several of them were taking care of babies in baby carriages. "Gee," said Charlie, "there's our chance." Nobody seemed to have heard about the French orphans, but when Jim told them all he knew, they seemed very much impressed. Most of the women had no money with them, but one of them left her baby carriage in charge of a friend and crossed over to her house. She came back with $0.25 and said she supposed she could have 6 peaches. Then she gave them to the different women and children she knew, keeping one for herself. When Charlie wanted to enter her contribution in his book she said, "Oh, never mind about my name, say, 'From a friend.'" "Let's go and ask other people for fruit," said Charlie when the last peach was sold. "Judge Baxter has a dandy garden. They would never miss some of their apples. They'd let us have a few, I know." They were passing Nancy's house at the time, and who should be skipping up the steps but Evelyn in a pink cotton gown and a pink sweater. Jim thought he had never seen so sweet a picture. "She's a peach," said Charlie, and indeed she did look like one, with her pink cheeks and pink frock against the back of the door, which was as green as the leaves of a peach. "Come on, Evie, and help us out," said Charlie. "We are selling fruit for the orphans. If you go up to the Baxters' house and ask if you can have some apples, I'm sure nobody can resist you." "I'll get Nancy to come with me." "Oh, we don't want Nancy," the boys said hastily. They had to go to the grocer's and borrow 2 large baskets, and the boys waited at the foot of the garden while Evelyn went to the Baxters' house. She was a little frightened after she had pulled the doorbell. A pleasant-looking maid in a black dress and a white apron came to the door. "Could I see Mrs. Baxter?" asked Evelyn. "Mrs. Baxter is out. Will you leave a message with me?" Evelyn looked so sweet that the maid wanted to hug and kiss her, for she had little sisters at home. "Is Judge Baxter in?" asked Evelyn. "No, he's out too." "I guess you'll just do as well. It's about the orphans." "The orphans?" "Yes, the French ones. My father, he's Mr. West, the lawyer, is getting money for them, and my brother, James West, Jr., is helping him. He'd like just a little fruit to sell for them." "Why doesn't he come up and speak for himself, instead of sending a baby like you?" "I don't know. He and Charlie Norcross are down in the garden." The pleasant young maid went along the garden walk with Evelyn. "I'm sure Judge Baxter would not mind you having a few of his early apples," she said, "but not those great baskets full." She sat down on a bench to watch the boys. "You can pick up all the windfalls you find on the ground," she told them. As they were walking home, Charlie said, "Let's go right back and fill our baskets with the good apples from the trees." "That wouldn't be fair," said Jim. "She was so nice I'd hate to get her into trouble." "She told us we could have some apples," said Charlie. "It is for the good of the cause. We can never sell these old windfalls except to the poor, and they can't give us much for them. I'm sure Judge Baxter would be glad to give them to us. He's such a great friend of your father's, and when my father was alive he was in his office." They had wonderful luck in getting away without being caught. Jim felt very mean, but he comforted himself with thinking about the French orphans, and Evelyn enjoyed the adventure. Whatever Jim did was right in her eyes. They sold all their apples and nobody asked too many questions, and when they counted up their money at the end of the day they had the big sum of $5.16. As they left the borrowed baskets at the grocer's, Charlie said, "Let's go into the drug store and get 3 sodas and a stick of candy with the 16 cents, and the money will come out just even." "It isn't our money," said Jim. "We've got to pay ourselves for our time and work," said Charlie. 16 cents is very little to take for such a hard day's work. This reasoning appealed to Evelyn, who had never had a glass of soda water. The children were hot and tired, and the soda water looked very delicious. They saw people sitting on stools and sipping glasses of it. Jim still felt a little doubtful. But Charlie, who was older than Jim and had charge of the money, went in and ordered 3 glasses of soda water. "What flavors do you want?" he asked. "Can I have strawberry?" said Evelyn, with shining eyes. "I'll take chocolate," said Jim, and Charlie chose pineapple. The fizzy soda water made Evelyn cough. She spilled a little on the white guimpe of her pink frock. She was sorry she had chosen strawberry, for it made such a bright stain that Anne would be sure to notice it. They spent the other cent in buying a long stick of candy, which they divided in 3 pieces. Jim and Evelyn were tired but happy when they got home. It had been a wonderful day. "Evelyn West, where have you been?" Anne asked, as the 2 children came into the house. "You were so late I telephoned to Mrs. Merrifield's, and I found you weren't there, and I've been telephoning all over the neighborhood about you." "She was safe with me," said Jim, with dignity. "I guess I can look after my little sister." "You bad boy! I don't know what you've been up to. I telephoned to Mrs. Norcross, thinking Evelyn might be there with you, and I found that you weren't, either of you there. Come, now, you may as well tell me. Where on earth have you been?" Jim was a truthful boy, but this seemed one of the times when silence was golden. To quote a favourite phrase of his father's, he did not answer. "Evelyn West, what have you been up to?" Anne asked. Evelyn did not want to get Jim into trouble. "Jim saw me going to Nancy's house," she said, "and so I went on a little walk with him." "Where did you walk to?" Anne asked sternly. "And what is that pink spot on your guimpe?" "A pink spot?" Evelyn asked, opening her brown eyes wide. "Why should there be a pink spot? How funny!" Just then Catherine came in, and she said in distress, "What do you suppose has happened? Some of those bad village boys has got in and stolen all our grapes and the best of the peaches. I thought the grapes would not be ripe enough to use until next week, so I didn't pick them. Now I wished I had. The little rascals! They say they are going to make an example of them and take them into court. I'm as sure as I can be of anything that it was those Maloney twins." Jim was feeling more and more uncomfortable. "I'm sure it wasn't the Maloneys," he said. "I feel terribly. I ought to have gone down into the garden, but Hector was out there, and I thought he'd bark if any stranger came, and I was busy cleaning my room. I haven't had a chance to do it since I got home." "Your father loves those grapes and peaches as he loves his eye-teeth," said Anne. "I just tremble to think what he'll say when he gets home." Chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of The Blue Aunt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. The Blue Aunt by Eliza Orne White. Chapter 13. The Homecoming. It was a little before supper time when the Wests got home. They walked up from the station, so it was nearer to go the back way. "What a wonderful trip we've had, James," said Mrs. West, with shining eyes. "It was even nicer than our first wedding journey, because now we have the children to come home to." "Yes," said Mr. West, and he kissed her, and as he was not much more giving to kissing people than Jim was, it was a great event. "Let's go up through the garden and see how the peaches and grapes are getting on." "Why, Sadie," he cried sharply, "the best of the peaches are gone, and there isn't a grape left. Not one, do you hear?" he thundered. "James, I am so sorry, but really it isn't my fault." "Of course not. But who can have taken them? I'll bet you anything it is those Mahoney twins. They are pests. They are to be brought up before Judge Baxter the next time they are caught. Anne, Catherine," he called out as he stamped into the house, "why didn't you keep watch over the garden? I can't be gone 5 minutes that something doesn't happen." Just then the telephone rang and Anne went to answer it. "Judge Baxter wants to speak to you over the telephone, Mr. West," she said. "He called you up Saturday evening, but I told him you were out of town." Jim felt very miserable. He could not hear what the judge was saying, but he could guess. "The rascals! The impudent scoundrels!" said his father. "No doubt it is the Mahoney twins." "What? My children? Mine? Impossible! Evelyn?" "Yes, I think you're right. It must have been some one else. French orphans! I don't know anything about it. I'll ask him." And he hung up the receiver and came hastily into the sitting room. "What is this about your stealing Judge Baxter's apples?" he asked. And Jim felt that the judgment day had come. "I said I knew you couldn't have stolen them. I said it must have been the Mahoney twins. Now, tell me the truth." Jim grew very red. "It wasn't the Mahoney twins, father. It was me. It didn't seem like stealing, because we sold them for the French orphans, and the girl told us we could have some. Only we took a lot more after she'd gone. She only meant us to take the windfalls, and we made quite a lot of money on the fruit. First I sold our grapes and peaches." "It was you who took our grapes and peaches?" "Yes, father," said Jim miserably. "I thought as it was for the orphans you wouldn't mind." "You knew I would mind," said his father sternly. "You can go and get the grapes back and take the money back. Do you hear?" "I can't, father. It was Mrs. Norcross, and she's got them all made into jelly by this time." "Mrs. Norcross! So Charlie had a hand in this. I might have known it. Well, it's bad enough to steal your father's fruit, my boy, but when it comes to my son robbing Judge Baxter's orchard, it is a little too much, and I have to try an important case before him next week." "Don't you speak to me, you little savage. Go right upstairs to bed. You needn't wait for your supper." Jim had never been so wretched in his life. His father had never been so angry with him before. His pleasant, cheerful world seemed crumbling to pieces. He had known all day that he had been doing wrong, but it had not seemed so very wrong to him because of the orphans, and his father did not seem to take them into account. And the worst of it was he was afraid his father would not let him give the $5 to Aunt Hilda for the orphans. Dear Aunt Hilda! She was just coming in at the front door now. "Why, what is the matter?" said Aunt Hilda, as she looked from her brother's excited face to Jim's miserable one. The poor child was trying to keep back his tears. "The matter is that my son has been stealing all my fruit and some of Judge Baxter's." Aunt Hilda's blue eyes looked very troubled, but instead of saying, "You bad boy," she went straight over to where Jim was standing, and putting her arm around him, she said, "I am so sorry, dear. Tell me all about it." Jim felt a sense of passionate gratitude to her for standing by him when he was in disgrace. A lump came into his throat, and for a moment he could not speak. "It was for the orphans," said Evelyn. "We got $5.16 for your orphans, Aunt Hilda, and we only kept 16 cents ourselves." "You kept 16 cents of money you begged for the orphans?" said his father. "That is downright dishonest. It is getting money on false pretenses." Jim said nothing. He had turned very white. "That's the sort of thing, my boy, that lands a man in state's prison later on. That's the way swindlers begin. I did not think my boy would spend money, given him for a cause, on himself." "Charlie said 16 cents was very little for a day's pay," said Evelyn. "So it was Charlie's idea spending the money. Why didn't you tell me that before?" "Because I had the soda water, too, and part of the stick of candy. You have a legal mind, Jim. I am sure you'll be a lawyer later on." "Well, I am glad you are not a telltale. That is a fault that is very hard to cure. And you can take 16 cents out of your bank and give it to Aunt Hilda." His father had calmed down. He did not understand just why. "It is awkward about Judge Baxter's apples," Mr. West said, "for I suppose they were sold to different people, so there is no chance of getting them back." "To lots of different ones," said Evelyn. "I guess they are mostly eaten by now." It was such fun to see the children beginning on them, and Anne can never say again I'm the dirtiest child in town, 'cause I'm not. There's lots as dirty as me. "I suppose you ate a few yourselves," said Mr. West. "We sampled them," Jim admitted, "and we ate 2 big bunches of our grapes and a few peaches." He looked at his father with a "now do your worst" expression. He had made a full confession and pleaded guilty. "Now go right upstairs to bed," said his father, but he no longer spoke in that angry voice. "I think the best way we can arrange with Judge Baxter," said his sister Hilda, "is for Jim and me to go over there tomorrow. I want to return Mrs. Baxter's call, and Jim owes Judge Baxter an apology, and while he is telling him how sorry and ashamed he is, I will read Mrs. Baxter some of my letters from France about the work there. You can send the judge some of your apples, James, when they are ripe." She went out into the entry to telephone to the Baxters to make the appointment, and as Jim's door was open he could hear what she was saying. Yes, it really was Jim and Evelyn. They did very wrong to take fruit they knew they had no right to touch. But if you could see how sorry Jim is, and how he owned up like a man, I know you would forgive him. It was a great temptation, for they were so eager to earn money for my French orphans, and those children, with Charlie Norcross's help, actually earned $5.16. Could you and Mrs. Baxter see Jim and me for a few minutes tomorrow afternoon? Jim wants to make an apology to you, and I want to read Mrs. Baxter my last letters from France. Of course, my brother will be glad to make you any compensation for the apples that you like, or give you some of his when they are ripe." "What? Oh, how good you are! That is too generous. How wonderful!" She came straight upstairs to Jim's room. He was crying, and she pretended not to notice it. "Jim, dear," she said, "there is one thing that can happen when we do wrong when we are very young. We need never do that wrong thing again. You have learned a lesson about stealing, and I am sure whoever else lands in prison it won't be you." Jim longed to give her a good hug, but he did nothing of the sort. "Your father gave you the best kind of punishment, for you will have a long time to think over what you did, because it is so early. But I want you to have one pleasant piece of news to think about, too. Judge Baxter says he forgives you for taking the apples, and he and Mrs. Baxter will be glad to see us tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock. But, Jim, this is the splendid bit of news. Judge Baxter has promised to give me $50 for my French orphans." End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Blue Aunt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. The Blue Aunt by Eliza Orne White. Chapter 14. The Letter from France. Jim was the first of the family to see the outside of the letter that brought such disturbing news, just as he had been the first to see the one that had led to Aunt Hilda's coming to them. This time he met the postman at the front door one afternoon. It was not the delightful postman who used to go past the kitchen window and linger for a talk with Catherine, but a much older man, who went about his business in a grave, silent manner, for the war had brought many changes. The postman had enlisted, and so had Tim, the chore man, so there was now no confusion between him and Tim, the kitten. There had been a fortnight without any chore man, when Mr. West had to bring up coal and wood and make a furnace fire. This was a joyous period to Jim, for his father let him carry up a stick or two of wood at a time, or some kindlings. But now they had a new chore man, who was so old they always called him Mr. Ryan, although his first name was Thomas, for Jim asked him what it was. The postman, without a word, handed Jim a letter in a thin envelope with a strange stamp. "It is a letter from France!" cried Jim, but the postman had already moved on, as if a letter from France was the same to him as one from Boston, and yet no letter had ever caused more consternation in the household than this one was to cause. Jim was sure the letter was from the lady to whom Aunt Hilda had sent the money for the French orphans, so he ran upstairs to his aunt's room, where she and his mother and Evelyn were sitting, while the kitten was frisking about, trying to decide which lap he liked best. He settled down in Mrs. West's first. This was agreeable in some ways, for she was knitting a khaki sweater, and it was warm and soft, and it was great fun to play with the brown ball. But when he knocked it off on the floor and then bit off the worsted close to the sweater, Mrs. West rose suddenly. "You bad, mischievous, objectionable pussy," she said. "I can't work with you in the room," and she folded up the sweater and put it in her knitting bag. "But mother," said Evelyn, "darling pussy knows no better. Khaki yarn to him is just like molasses candy to us. Come, pussy, and sit in my lap." He tried it, but there were drawbacks to this, too, for Evelyn never sat still more than 2 minutes at a time, and besides, her lap was very small. So he jumped down, and had just settled himself comfortably in Aunt Hilda's lap when Jim came into the room. "Here's a letter from France!" he cried. Aunt Hilda was reading aloud, and she closed the book so suddenly that the kitten jumped down and went over to the window seat. This was a tried friend that never disappointed him. Aunt Hilda opened the letter, and looked very grave as she read it. "What does the lady say about the money you sent?" asked Jim. "There hasn't been time for it to get there. This is about something else. This is from the same friend. She wants me to come over and help her with the work. She has a place for me at last." "Oh, but we can't let you go," said Mrs. West. "James and I were talking it over last night. We both said we hoped you would live with us always. You are the dearest sister that ever was, and the sweetest aunt, and the most wonderful mother's helper and governess all in one. James and I said we thought it was too much to have all this for nothing, and we felt we should like to give you a salary so you could feel entirely independent." The tears came into Hilda's eyes. She went over and put her arm around her sister-in-law. "What a dear you are, Sadie," she said. "I am sure nobody ever had an own sister more devoted and generous. If I had been choosing a sister out of the whole world, I could not have picked out any one more to my taste. But you see it is this way. You remember when I wrote to you last spring I told you I had a plan for the autumn. This was it. I wanted to see my own people first, and then go over and work with my friends in the reconstruction work among the women and children in France. When my father died and my happy world went to pieces, I wanted to do some work for someone else, and now the chance has come." "But you needn't take it," said Mrs. West. "Someone else could take your place over there, and no one in the wide world could take your place with us." "Yes, I believe that is true," Hilda said slowly. "Life is a strange thing. We want something so much, and when we can have it, I never thought I could have a happy, ready-made world just for the asking, like what you have given me. And yet, I know I could do the other work, and the chance has come. Think it over, dear. Don't decide hastily. It seems to me as if your place is here." Aunt Hilda was very grave all the evening, as if she were trying to make up her mind, and she kissed Evelyn twice when she went upstairs to bed with her mother, and when it was time for Jim to go she kissed him. This was unusual. He pretended not to like it, but he did. Jim's room was over the sitting room, and he was sure she was talking about her plan, for he could hear voices, first hers, and then his father's, getting louder and louder. His door was open a crack into the entry, and presently he heard the sitting room door open. "I'll never think you are right, never, never," his father said. "Our children have more claim on you than all the French orphans put together. But so few are wanted over there now, and it is such a wonderful chance, and I planned for it last spring before I came to you." "That makes no difference. It is a crazy plan." She was coming up the stairs now, and Jim got out of bed and pattered along the entry in his bare feet to meet her. "Aunt Hilda, are you going away?" he asked. She told him to get back into bed, and then she sat down on the foot of his bed, and rolled herself up in the comforter. "Dearest," she said, "I think you can understand, even if your father can't, for you would like to go to France and fight if you were old enough. Now, I want to help, too, and this chance has come, but I am so happy here with all of you that I almost wish it had not come. I almost think your father is right, and that it is my duty as well as my pleasure to stay with you." "I don't know how we get on without you," said Jim, "and mother needs you so much, too." "That is what your father said, and yet I was so eager last spring to get the chance, and now I have it. It seems to me that not to go to France now would be like a soldier who was drafted, claiming exemption for a reason that did not hold. To let someone go in my place would be to shirk, and so," said Aunt Hilda, in her sweet, grave voice, "I have decided to go, and I know you will understand." A lump came into Jim's throat. His aunt took his hand in hers, and he gripped it. It seemed as if his heart were breaking. I guess I understand," he said. Jim's mother understood, too, which was a great comfort to Hilda. But little Evelyn could not see why Aunt Hilda was going. She cried bitterly when she heard the news, and Evelyn did not cry easily. "What did you come at all for? Just to go away again?" she said reproachfully. "Oh, but Aunt Hilda is coming back again, perhaps in 6 months. Darling child, Don't you want her to go over and work with her friends to help the poor little children who haven't any fathers?" "No, I don't," said Evelyn. "But, dearest," her mother went on, "you know how much you like the French orphans." "I hate the French orphans," said Evelyn unexpectedly, "for they are taking Aunt Hilda away from us." "But she is coming back again," said Jim. "She's only promising to go for 6 months, and the war may be over before that." "It may last for 6 years," said Evelyn. "You said it might." "And meanwhile," said Aunt Hilda, "I am going to stay with you until the day after Thanksgiving. So we'll have time to be as merry as possible for nearly a month. And if Aunt Charlotte and Aunt Mattie and the children come here for Thanksgiving, think what fun that will be." So Evelyn dried her eyes and began to look forward to Thanksgiving. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Blue Aunt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. The Blue Aunt by Eliza Orne White. Chapter 15. The Thanksgiving Candle. Getting ready for Thanksgiving was almost as much fun as the day itself, and Evelyn spent a great deal of time in the kitchen, both at her own house and at Nancy's, watching the delicious pies that were being made, and sometimes getting a taste of the interesting mixtures. "They are having mock mince meat at Nancy's house," she told Catherine. "It is made of green tomatoes, and it tastes just as nice can be. Why don't you make yours of green tomatoes?" "There are a few other things in it besides green tomatoes," said Catherine, "and I like my own way best. Look out! Your mother doesn't want you eating mince pie meat. Goodness gracious! The kitten is up on the table again. I'll have to put you both out of the kitchen." "That is what Maria said at Nancy's house," said Evelyn, smacking her lips. "And I told her that you were always so good-natured and loved children and never minded what we did. It is nicer than mock mince pie, Catherine. It truly is. Catherine, don't you think Thanksgiving is the nicest day in the whole year, except Christmas?" "I might if I had anything to be thankful about." "But, Catherine, everybody has something to be thankful about. Mother said so, and Aunt Hilda is going to light the green candle Thanksgiving night, the big fat one she got at North Sandhurst, and we are going to put it in the window, 'cause she won't be here Christmas Eve, Aunt Hilda says. A bayberry candle burned to the socket brings luck to the house, food to the larder, and gold to the pocket. Did you ever hear that, Catherine?" "No, I never did." "Well, I never did until Aunt Hilda taught it to me. She says on Thanksgiving Day we are all to think what we are thankful about, and I am thankful if any Tim had to go it was the chore man and not the kitten. Aren't you, Catherine?" "Well, you see, Tim, the chore man, was of use to me," said Catherine. "He was an especially kind friend of mine, and so was the postman, and with both of them gone and my brother at the war, it makes a sad Thanksgiving for me." "Dear Catherine," said Evelyn, and she put her arm around Catherine's neck, "you've got me." "Yes, bless your heart," said Catherine. "You are my little comfort, you bad kitten." And she took the pussy off the table again, and began gently stroking him. "I shall have to put you upstairs." "There's another thing to be thankful for," said Evelyn. "When they come down from the farm they are going to bring a turkey with them. Aren't you thankful we are going to have a turkey for dinner, Catherine?" "I shall be more thankful when I get it cooked. They are only to have chickens at Nancy's house," Evelyn went on, "'cause turkeys are so expensive. And being a minister, Nancy's father thought he ought not to have a turkey. I am glad my father is not a minister, and if the turkey is a present, it does not cost anything. Oh, Catherine, it seems as if I couldn't wait for Thanksgiving Day to come, and I'm just crazy for a snowstorm. I'm just longing and longing for snow. Mother says that isn't the kind of thing to pray about, 'cause God couldn't make it snow to suit all the little children who want it, and yet not snow for all the people who want bare ground. But I long and long for a snowstorm, just as I longed and longed for a pussycat, and he came, and perhaps the snowstorm will. And it did. Just the day before Thanksgiving the snowy flakes began to come down, and they powdered the road thick and white, and they powdered the fir trees, and covered the lilac bush with white. Evelyn hopped and skipped for joy, and she said, "They'll be sleighing Thanksgiving Day." It was a very exciting time, for in the afternoon, while it was still snowing fast, the family from the farm arrived. Mr. West met them at the station, and they all came up in a big covered sleigh. Aunt Mattie was the first to come into the house, and it was snowing so fast that she had to shake the white flakes off her cloak, although she had only walked from the gate to the front door. She carried a large basket, and when it was open in the kitchen, there was the turkey inside all ready to be cooked, and around the turkey were turnips and onions from the farm. Aunt Charlotte looked very dignified and proper as she carried a dress suit case that she refused to hand over to any one else. It was full of jars of different kinds of preserves, packed in hay so that they would not get broken. Next came Harry, staggering under a huge dress suit case. When it was opened, Evelyn saw that there were squashes in it, cut in pieces so they would fit in, and also a cabbage and enough potatoes for a Thanksgiving dinner. Lottie came next with another bag that held some delicious pats of butter from the farm, and Prue tried to carry a jug of cider that was waiting on the brick walk for someone to take. "Why didn't you pack a box and send all these things down by express?" Mr. West asked, as he put the jug of cider on the kitchen table. "James West," said Aunt Mattie. "That shows how little you know about country expresses in war times. The things might not have arrived until next week and been frozen on the way, so we packed our clothes in trunks and carried our provisions by hand. It is bad enough not to have all of you with us at the farm as we first planned, but it would be 10 times worse if we could not give you some of the products of the farm." "And you are really going to France, Hilda? I admire your spirit. How I wish I were going with you." Evelyn had one of her bright ideas. "Couldn't you go instead of Aunt Hilda?" she asked. "We need her so much." But for some reason no one seemed to think this plan could be carried out. It stopped snowing some time in the night, and the children waked to a white world on which the sun shone so brightly that there were myriads of glittering stars on trees and shrubs. First, everybody went to church just as if it were Sunday, and as there were 10 people they filled 2 pews. Then came the Thanksgiving dinner, which was the best dinner Evelyn had ever eaten, and afterwards a big pung came around to the door with 2 horses, and the children and grown people piled in and went for a sleigh ride into the country. Mrs. West stayed at home with Aunt Charlotte, who did not feel equal to the cold ride, so there was room for Nancy Merrifield and Charlie Norcross. Evelyn was blissfully happy as she curled down between her Aunt Hilda and Nancy. They drove through the pine and fir woods, where the green showed through the white, and they drove through little villages where children were out with their sleds. When they turned to come back it was beginning to grow dark, and there was a lovely pink light in the sky, and the towers and spires of churches stood out gray against it, and the street lamps were lighted, and it all seemed like a beautiful new world, familiar and yet strange. As they drove up to the door on their return, there, in one of the front windows, was the large bayberry Thanksgiving candle, lighted and sending out its cheerful beams into a cold world. The room looked so pleasant as they glanced in, with a bright fire burning on the hearth, and Aunt Charlotte and Mrs. West sitting there with their knitting, that nobody minded that the sleigh ride was over. Nancy stayed to supper and was to spend the night, for she and Evelyn had always spent Thanksgiving night together ever since they were tiny tots. After supper all the family, big and little, sat in the room where the Thanksgiving candle was burning, and Aunt Hilda said, "Now we will each say what has given us especial pleasure today. We'll begin with Evelyn, because she is the youngest. Have I got to say just one thing? 'Cause there are lots of them." As you are the youngest, you can be thankful for 3 things, but every one else must say only one thing. I'm thankful for the snow and the lovely sleigh ride and the turkey and—" "That's 3 things," said Jim. "Only 2. The sleigh ride and the snow are 1. And I'm thankful Prue is here for Thanksgiving." "Aren't you thankful I'm here?" asked Harry. Evelyn stopped to think. "Yes, I'm thankful you all came, only I supposed I had to pick out one person. But there's 2 here younger than me. Aunt Hilda," Evelyn said as she stroked the kitten's back. He was curled up on the table under the lamp, and Hector was lying at Jim's feet. "It's Tim's first Thanksgiving Day," said Evelyn, as she put her ear down close to the pussy. "He's thinking things," she said, "and I'm listening to what he thinks. He's thankful he doesn't live at Ginger's house." "Why?" asked Nancy. "'Cause Ginger can't lie on tables and skip round on mantel-pieces. What's Hector saying to you, Jim?" "He says he's thankful he didn't have to go to church on Thanksgiving Day." "He missed a great deal," said Mrs. West. "Mr. Merrifield gave us a very fine sermon." They all made merry over the different things they were thankful for, which were most of them said to make the others laugh, for nobody wanted to be too serious on Aunt Hilda's last evening. When he came to Aunt Charlotte, the oldest, she said, "I am thankful that in this year of fiery trial for the country, I have learned to know and love my dear niece, Hilda." So everybody was serious just at the last, and then the 3 little girls had to go off to bed. They were to sleep together, widthway, in the old-fashioned 4-poster bed in the second best spare room, which was the only bed in the house that was wide enough. All 3 of the children wanted to sleep in the middle, so Aunt Hilda finally drew lots, and it was Nancy who had the coveted place. Aunt Hilda had brought up the green candle and put it in the window, and the cheerful light shone out into the dark night, and every one who passed outside thought what happy people lived in the house. And it was true, although now that the end of Aunt Hilda's visit had come, every one was feeling sad. She looked so sweet as she sat there in the candle light that the children could not bear to think she was going to leave them the next day. She was to start so early the next morning that she said she would not go downstairs again, and she had slipped on her blue dressing gown. Her dark hair was braided in one thick braid for the night, and was hanging down her back, and her blue eyes looked full of sweetness and light. The children would always think of that picture of their dear blue aunt, until she came back to them from across the sea. After they had said their prayers, Nancy said, "Won't you say a prayer too, Miss Hilda?" She drew her chair up to the bed, and her short prayer was one that made them all want to be good and helpful while she was away. After Jim and Harry came up to bed she went into their room. She knew Jim would miss her more than Evelyn would, for he was older and, besides, he had not so many friends. "I shall go so early in the morning that you boys won't be up," she said, "so I'll say good-bye to-night." "I'll be up," Jim said in an odd voice, and she suspected that the tears were not far away. "Jim," she said, "I have this blank book I'm going to give you, so you can paste in all the interesting things about the orphans, and I'll write to you very often." "I wish I could go with you, Aunt Hilda. I wish I was a French orphan." "Oh, no, dear, you couldn't be spared. I depend on you to look after your mother and see she doesn't do too much. I may not stay longer than 6 months. That will not be long in passing, but whether the time is longer or shorter, I hope you boys will both of you do your best, so I shall be proud of you when I come back." And before Aunt Hilda left them, she said a short prayer. "We thank Thee, O Lord, for all the happiness we have had this year, in spite of the grief of nations, and even in black days there is the joy of the love of friends and the comfort of feeling we are trying to help each other. If it be Thy will, O Lord, we pray that this war may end before another Thanksgiving Day, and that peace may come to all the nations, and the world be a big, unselfish family. But whether the war is longer or shorter, we pray that in each household throughout the whole world, the older children may take thought for the younger and weaker ones, and the younger ones be kind to the older ones, For if all children try faithfully to do their best, when they grow to be men and women, love will prevail and there can be no such thing as war. Be with those who stay and those who go, and, if it be thy will, bring us together again in thy good time. Amen. Evelyn had been sure she should wake early in the morning and say good-bye to her dear blue aunt. But she sat up so late she did not wake until she heard the front door shut with a bang. Then she scrambled out of bed and ran to the window. She's going, she cried to Prue and Nancy. They rubbed their eyes and tried to get up, but the bed was warm and comfortable, and the room was cold. Aunt Hilda, in her new fur coat, was walking down the brick walk to the waiting sleigh. Evelyn's father was on one side of her and Jim on the other side, and he had hold of her hand. Jim's sturdy little figure was walking along with a stride as much like his father's as his small legs could make it. Evelyn shed a few tears as she saw her aunt whirled away out of her sight. "Come and get back into bed. It isn't time to get up," said Prue in her cheerful voice. "It's going to be a lovely day, and they'll be coasting. Aren't you glad I am going to stay 2 whole weeks?" So Evelyn dried her eyes, and thought how glad she was to have a visit from darling Prue. End of chapter 15. End of The Blue Aunt by Eliza Orne White.